The movie starts in the United States, where a civil war has broken out. Texas and California have left the country and formed the WF, or Western Forces Group, while Florida has created its own team. A president who was in his third term was leading the government forces against the group that wanted to leave, and he often comes on TV to give speeches promising victory is near thanks to the defeat of the loyalist states. However, no one believes him, as he is practicing the speeches and doesn't speak sincerely. It was only a matter of time before Washington, D.C. was reached by the WF. As the scene changes, we meet our main character, photographer Lee Miller. She watches the president's speech from her hotel room in New York, and even takes a picture of the TV. She seems to have no feelings and does not appear to be moved by the speech, and soon we get an explosion, a bombing, happening in the middle of the city. However, even though she sees it, she doesn't react to it as if it happens all the time, and sees it regularly. The next day, Lee and her co-worker, reporter Joel, take a car downtown to cover a protest in the middle of the city, where desperate people were asking for water. The civilians confront the police officers, and the situation gets out of control, and meanwhile, Lee is given a bright vest before she mixes with the crowd to take some pictures. Things soon get violent as the police officers try to punish the people back, only for the crowd to fight back. This doesn't scare Lee, who just keeps taking pictures, capturing the unsettling timeline of America. However, Lee notices a young photographer who is struggling to get a good angle, and the young lady gets knocked over by the crowd, and Lee immediately walks toward her and pulls her to safety to make sure she's okay. The young lady's name was Jessie, and seems to know Lee from the media industry, and is even a fan. Lee gives her the vest she got from her friend, but before she can get back, chaos happens. Lee pushes Jessie to take cover behind a car right before a bomb explodes, killing almost all the protesters. For several minutes, Jessie can't hear anything and has to deal with her shock. However, Lee quickly comes out to take pictures of all the brutally killed bodies. Lee was still emotionless and seems to be used to explosions. Jessie also forces herself to take pictures as well, but she captures Lee, who reminds her of her bravery. Next, we see Lee at her hotel, where her fellow journalists were also staying, and she and Joel discuss their options with their mentor, Sammy. And while Sammy was more experienced and an older guy in the industry, he gives them his friendly advice. Meanwhile, Lee was trying to upload her pictures despite the slow Wi-Fi, and Joel mentions that there are rumors of a big attack on July 4th to make it historically relevant, but they aren't sure whether to believe it. At that moment, the power goes out, which happens often since the war started, and that's why the hotel had a generator ready. After some chat, Sammy learns the duo will drive through the country's war zones to reach Washington, but not to cover the front lines. They won the last interview with the president, who hasn't given an interview in 14 months, and in fact, journalists get shot if they approach the White House. Sammy thinks their plan is crazy and even knows the best route to reach DC, so Lee guesses he wants to reach DC too. However, Sammy wants to go to the front lines in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he needs a ride. At first, Lee and Joel were worried because Sammy was too old to run, but in the end, Lee agrees to bring him. Afterward, Lee tries going to her room on the 10th floor, and the receptionist reminds her that the power comes and goes, so using the elevator could be a risk. At that moment, she's approached by Jessie, who's come to thank her and gives her the bright vest back, and Lee tells her to keep it and to get a helmet for the future. Jessie explains that she's been a regular photographer so far, and she's trying to become a war photographer, which is why Lee is her hero. The two separate as Lee heads to the stairs to reach her room, and Jessie is seen walking to the spot where Joel and Sammy were sitting. Later in her room, Lee takes a bath to try to relax. However, the time we see her true emotions in a flashback, where she experienced several traumas in her career. She's a war journalist and her life isn't easy, and to this day, she was still haunted by all the atrocities that she's seen in the many wars she covered. There's been a disgusting amount of death, destruction, and torture, and Lee took pictures of all of it while being unable to help those in need. She wipes her tears to keep going, but we understand that she's in deep agony on the inside. The next morning, the group gets ready to leave, and when Lee arrives in the car, she's surprised and shocked to find Jessie in the car. She sets Joel aside to ask why on earth the young girl is with them, and he explains that they met her the previous night and she wanted to tag along with them as they head for DC. Joel points out that she also started her career when she was younger than Jesse, so she cannot miss Jesse unless she's a hypocrite. With no arguments left, Lee agrees to bring Jesse, but only if they drop her off at Charlottesville with Sammy, where he will also be dropped off. The group takes off, and when they leave the city, Jesse initiates looking for something in her bag, but Sammy taps her and reminds her that she doesn't want to miss this, so she must pay attention. Meanwhile, we see the detonated road where the streets are full of abandoned and broken cars, and it's almost like an apocalyptic scene where America is no longer America. They drive around them and find their way, and at the checkpoint, soldiers make sure to check their journalists' IDs before letting them pass. During the trip, Sammy and Joel discuss what kind of questions Joel can ask during the interview, like touching on the subjects of disbanding the FBI and using airstrikes against American citizens. Eventually, they find a gas station guarded by 3 armed men, and they really needed the fuel, so they risked stopping. At first, the men didn't want to share, but they quickly change their minds when Lee offers to pay extra in Canadian dollars. While they fill the tank, Jesse notices something in the distance and goes to check. One of the men spots her and follows her, and they start to chat once he approaches her, and Lee notices them from afar. She gets worried about them and follows them as well, and to Jesse's disgust, the men show her a couple of men hanged by their wrists after being severely tortured and beaten. The gunman explains that they were looters and his group had been arguing over what to do with them for days since they were still alive. He gives Jesse the power to choose whether to keep them alive or for the men to execute them, but Jesse freezes in terror. In the meantime, Lee has come close to them, but she hasn't said anything yet, and when the men put pressure on Jesse, noticing her fear, Lee steps in and asks the gunman if she could take some pictures. She was still emotionless and asks if he could also pose in the middle. He does so holding his weapon, and Lee takes the pictures. And shortly after, the group returns to the car and they continue their journey. Jessie was still in shock, but now she snaps out of it and she blames herself for not being strong and taking the pictures herself. She complains that she didn't take a single photo and wonders if she could have helped. Lee, on the other hand, explains that this is the life of a journalist, so she must get used to it because it's gonna get much worse later. Jessie couldn't help but cry, but she promises to be braver in the future, and Lee says they're heading into an idealistic situation, so crying wouldn't be much of a help. As they continue to drive, they hear more empty speeches from the president on the radio, and watch the destruction that surrounds them. There are dead bodies everywhere, but something else catches Lee's attention, and she makes Joel stop the car. Once he pulls over, she asks Jessie to come along with her, and the two head to the scene, and it was a crashed helicopter that caught Lee's attention, and she demanded Jessie take pictures of it. Jessie does so, and using the spare time as a chance to bond, she apologizes for being a burden and explains that her old-style camera used to belong to her dad. In the evening, the group stops to rest, and while watching gunfire in a distance, Lee talks with Sammy about how she used to cover wars as a way to send home some warnings, yet now the violence is right around the corner. Sammy realizes she was losing faith in the power of journalism, and that's why she's being hard on Jessie. Meanwhile, Joel comes to them and becomes involved in their conversation, and he wants to go and see what has happened in a distance where gunfire is heard. Lee tells him they aren't going now, but they could check it out the next day, and he leaves them and goes to meet Jessie, who was lying in the back of the car trying to recover from what she saw earlier and what she was hearing in the distance. He tells her that they will be going there to check on the aftermath, and she really gets excited, and she of course wants to take good pictures regardless of the breathtaking brutality of the scene. Joel offers her a sleeping pill for the night if she wants to, but Jessie thanks him for his thoughts, and as the night goes deeper, Sammy returns to sleep in the car, but Lee spends the night right where she sat, listening to the gunfire. The next day they go to the area where the gunfire they saw last night occurred, and Lee and Jessie take tons of pictures as the two groups continue to fire at each other, with a guy stuck in the middle. A team throws out a smoke grenade to offer some cover, however as soon as the guy tries to run, he gets shot, and his bleeding gets captured on camera, and Jessie was the one that was taking it, and her life had just begun in this traumatic career. The man's teammates drag him to safety and try their best to deal with his wound. However, the man won't stop bleeding and dies as Jessie takes photos of the whole process. Afterward, the team enters the building and the two journalists follow, and they find the bleeding man asking for help, and he gets shot down. Jessie can't help cheering as the team finishes searching the building, and by the end Joel was laughing with a fighter as if it was a normal workday. The soldiers capture a few enemies and take them out for execution, which Jessie takes pictures of. At some point, the reporters get to a camp for people who had to leave their homes, and all the tents were taken, so they have to sleep in their cars. Jessie was working on her photos the old-fashioned way, and she keeps getting closer to Lee, who tells her that her parents are also on a farm, acting like nothing was wrong. When Jessie finally looks at her photos, she was sad and they don't look good, but Lee tells her that this is normal. Only 1 out of every 30 photos will be good. Jessie eventually finds a great picture of a man who was dying, and Lee says nice things about her work, and that night the group gets to relax with other people who had to leave their homes before they go back to the terrible things in the morning. They keep going on their trip as the reporters see the endless death and destruction on the road, and Jessie takes more photos, adding the faces of her friends to the pictures for extra effect. Eventually they get to a toilet that looks perfectly normal, with people hanging out on the streets and peace everywhere. They stop at a clothing store and ask the worker what's happening, and the worker explains that her town had decided to just ignore the war, and Jessie gets Lee to try on a dress, saying that just because there's a war doesn't mean she can't have nice things. She teases her about how she looks and takes a picture of Lee's smile because it's the first time she's seen it. After that, Lee goes back to Sammy, who points out that there are men with guns on the roofs, and he also says that this life wouldn't have been right for them because it's boring, and at some point the group finds an empty circus with a dead man in the middle of the road, and Lee checks the area with her camera zoom but doesn't see anyone. Joel decides to go forward, but as soon as they go under the entrance arch, their window gets shot. Panicking, Joel drives faster and runs over the body until he finds a safe place near a truck to stop. There they find 2 soldiers who are hidden and waiting for the shooter in the house to show themselves. As the reporters move around to cover this incident, the shooter shoots at them and misses, and Jessie and Lee take pictures, while Joel tries talking to the soldiers, wanting to know which side they and the shooter are on. However, the soldiers aren't on any team, and they're just 2 guys trying to kill a person who wants to kill them back. After some waiting, the soldiers finally take down the shooter and the group can leave safely, and at some point, the reporters notice a car speeding to catch up to them, and scared, Lee slows down to let them pass. However, the car drives next to them and a guy yells at them, giving them a fright. Thankfully, there's a joke, and these guys are Tony and Bohai, fellow reporters and friends of Joel. It turns out that during their night at the hotel, Joel got drunk and told Tony where they were going, and Tony also reveals that Joel had flirted with Jessie, and he's so happy to see them that he climbs through the window and gets into the car with them, saying that they're more fun. Jessie was impressed and tries the same trick, ending up in the other car. Bohai likes her better than Tony and drives faster to leave Jessie, and Lee was worried even though Tony says Bohai is trustworthy, and she gets even more nervous when they stop seeing the other car ahead of them. Suddenly, a military car passes by and Lee had to go off the road to avoid crashing, and luckily she stopped the car right before they could hit a tree, and they quickly get back on the road to find Bohai's car left by a farm with its doors open. The group goes to check it out and finds out Bohai and Jessie were caught by loyalist gunmen who were making them kneel while dropping bodies in a big grave. Sammy points out that these guys aren't normal soldiers because they're clearly doing this in secret, but Joel thinks their pass IDs can keep them safe everywhere. Lee, Joel, and Tony walk up to the gunmen and explain that Bohai and Jessie are part of their reporter group, promising that they're going to Charlottesville to cover a story about a university opening again. Without thinking, the head gunman shoots Bohai, leaving Jessie shocked and scared, and making Tony cry. The gunman asks them where they are from, so Lee, Joel, and Jessie say their home states. However, when Tony explains that he's from Hong Kong, he gets shot too. As everyone panics, Sammy shows up in the car and hits the soldiers with it, making them fall to their graves. Jessie accidentally falls as well, and she has to climb on the big pile of dead bodies to get out, and Joel helps her, and the group gets back in their car to drive away, and ignoring the remaining gunmen who try to shoot them as they escape. On the road, Jessie and Joel have breakdowns, and Jessie even throws up, and they barely travel a mile or two before Sammy announces he can't drive anymore, and the group finds out that he's been shot. They move him to the back seat, and Joel takes over the wheel, driving as fast as possible through a burning forest. And meanwhile, Sammy was about to pass out and becomes fascinated by the sight of the burning forest, showing he's indeed dying. Eventually, they get to the WF military base in Charlottesville, where they have a flag with only 2 stars. Unfortunately, it was too late and Sammy was dead, and as Joel yells at the wind, grieving the deaths of all the people he loved, the soldiers take Sammy's body away in a box. As for Lee, she stares at a picture she took of dead Sammy, only to delete it in disappointment. Moments later, they learn from reporter friends that most of the loyalists have already given up, so DC's undefeated except for a few remaining soldiers. The president's death is imminent, which means the group can't have their interview. Joel was incredibly annoyed because it means Sammy died for nothing, and Lee then goes to Jessie, where she was sitting alone in silence, and they both take a moment to grieve together. And Jessie admits that these past few days she's felt the most scared in her life, but also the most alive. Later, while Lee was washing Sammy's blood off the car, the trio agrees to leave with the WF so they can cover their attack on the White House. Most of the loyalists may have given up, but there are still enough of them to keep the fight on the streets. Shortly as the WF attacks the Lincoln Memorial, Jessie, Lee, and Joel follow the soldiers through the area. Jessie was taking plenty of powerful pictures, but Lee freezes when she's hit by her PTSD. Joel makes her snap out of it with a tank and a helicopter clearing the way on the streets, allowing them to keep moving. The soldiers go to different roofs to establish a line of defense, and the reporters hide behind an armored car to follow the story. Suddenly, an explosion causes the armored car to drive away, so the group had to run and hide, and Jessie was slower because she keeps taking pictures, especially one of a man in flames, and she also gets some great shots of a tank finally breaking the wall surrounding the White House. Lee was still struggling and even crying and breaking down, so Joel had to keep her moving, and nearby another reporter and cameraman were recording the whole deal, regardless of the incapacitating situation in the area. At that moment, they notice some Secret Service agents bringing the president out of the White House and putting him in a car, and 3 vehicles leave the area, and as soon as they crash onto the streets, the soldiers surround them to shoot every single person inside, regardless of who they are. Jessie takes more pictures, however Lee guesses that this is a decoy and drags Joel and Jessie into the White House to find the actual president. And some soldiers notice this and follow them. Inside the White House, they find a few bodies and not much else, and Joel tells them that nobody was in the house, but shortly, the soldiers that follow them burst in, and they scold them for taking the lead and entering the White House without cover. The soldiers then inspect the house and start a thorough search, which leads them to find an agent surrendering in the conference room. Meanwhile, Lee and Jessie take pictures of every dead body to find on their way, and they finally come across the discussion between the soldiers and the woman in the conference room, and she was putting her hands up for them not to shoot her, and she tries to negotiate, asking if they are WF, discussing the president's surrender. The soldiers don't say much, except ask her where the damned president is. At this point, they've all lost it, and they just want to execute the president, and regardless of their request, the woman asks for the president to be taken to a neutral country, like Greenland or maybe Alaska. A more alert Lee takes pictures with Jessie as the agent is finally put down by the soldiers. They then head straight to the next room hoping to find the president hiding, and more secret agents open fire in the corridors, and Jessie and Joel do their best to keep taking photos of every death that occurs in the White House. They run through multiple rooms and corridors, shooting one loyalist after the other with no mercy or regret. When they reach the area at the back, the area that leads to the president's office, Jessie takes a risk by standing in the middle of the hallway for a picture. But when Lee sees Jessie standing in the open space, she doesn't hesitate to jump in front of the young Jessie, to cover her from the incoming open fire. This results in the fighters shooting Lee in the back instead of Jesse, and at this very moment, Jesse got the chance to capture several pictures of Lee falling to the ground, and she was in shock as she did it fast, but she still can't believe Lee is dead lying next to her. Joel comes to check on Lee, but he doesn't say anything or react, and he just heads to the office where the soldiers have managed to kill the guards and are entering, and before going, he told the frozen Jesse to come along to the Oval Office. Jesse was in a state of shock for a brief moment, but she soon gets up firmly to tag along with Joel, and meanwhile the soldiers are dragging the president from below his desk, and just before they can shoot, Joel asks them to wait because he needs a quote. He asks the president to say something, and the president says, "Don't let them kill me," and Joel tells him, "That will do," and after that there wasn't much to say, and Jesse took her camera to capture the last moment, and the soldiers finally shoot the president down, killing him and winning the war. Although we know there's no winner in a game of war, Jesse marks the final history of this battle by taking the final picture of the soldiers posing next to the dead body. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.